The mansion had been silent for 47 days. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the crushing kind. The kind that pressed down on everyone's chest like a heavy stone. And on this cold Tuesday morning, that silence was about to shatter in the most unexpected way. Margaret Hayes stood in the kitchen of the Foster mansion, her dark hands trembling as she held a wooden spoon. The old lullaby rose from her throat almost without thinking, soft at first, then growing stronger. Her voice, rich and warm like honey, filled the enormous kitchen with a melody she'd sung to hundreds of children over her 40 years as a nanny. But she didn't know that upstairs, 7-year-old Emma Foster had stopped crying for the first time in weeks. She didn't know that billionaire tech mogul Richard Foster was frozen at his office door, his hand on the doorknob, listening to something he thought he'd never hear again. And she certainly didn't know that in exactly 17 minutes, her simple act of singing would set off a chain of events that would change everything. What happened next still gives me chills. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. Welcome to stories where wealth meets humanity and every moment reveals the unexpected. Subscribe now for more powerful billionaire stories that will move and inspire you. 3 months earlier, the Foster mansion had been alive with sound. Emma's laughter echoed through marble hallways. Her mother Sarah's piano music drifted from the music room every afternoon. Even Richard, usually buried in his work, would smile at the dinner table. Then came the accident. Sarah Foster's car had slid on black ice one rainy November evening. She never made it home from her charity meeting. The doctors did everything they could, but some things can't be fixed with money or technology or prayers. After the funeral, the mansion became a tomb. Richard threw himself into work, leaving before sunrise and returning after midnight. Emma stopped talking. She stopped playing. She stopped being a child. The household staff whispered in corners, not knowing how to help. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been for a little girl? Losing her mother and watching her father disappear into his grief? The previous nanny, a strict woman named Mrs. Crawford, couldn't handle Emma's silent grief. After 2 weeks of the child refusing to eat or speak, she quit. Then came another nanny, younger and cheerful, who tried too hard and lasted only 10 days. A third lasted 6. I need someone, Richard told the agency director, his voice hollow and distant. Someone who can, I don't know, someone who can reach her. Wait, I need to tell you something crucial. Richard Foster was one of the richest men in America. His tech company was worth billions. He could hire anyone, buy anything, solve any problem with money. But his daughter was slipping away from him, retreating into a darkness he couldn't reach, and all his wealth meant nothing. That's when Margaret Hayes walked into the agency office. At 63 years old, Margaret wasn't what most billionaires looked for in a nanny. She was older, she moved slower, and she spoke her mind without apology. But she had something that couldn't be bought. Wisdom earned through decades of loving other people's children. I can't promise miracles, Margaret told Richard at their interview, looking him straight in the eye. But I can promise I'll show up, every day, no matter how hard it gets. Richard hired her on the spot. Little did he know, this decision would change everything. Margaret's first day at the Foster mansion was the hardest. Emma sat in her room, a palace of pink and white with toys that hadn't been touched in weeks. The little girl stared out the window, her blonde hair unbrushed, her eyes empty. Hello, Emma, Margaret said softly, sitting in a chair by the door. Not too close, not pushing. My name is Margaret. I'm going to be here with you for a while. Nothing, not even a glance. I lost someone too, Margaret continued, her voice gentle. My husband. 10 years ago now. Some days I didn't want to talk either. The smallest flicker, Emma's fingers twitched. Margaret came back the next day. And the next. And the next. She didn't force Emma to talk or play or eat. She just showed up. Sometimes she sat in silence. Sometimes she talked about small things, the birds outside, the weather, a funny thing that happened at the grocery store. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss the next powerful billionaire story. 2 weeks in, Emma finally looked at her. Just for a second, but it was something. 3 weeks in, Emma ate half a sandwich while Margaret sat nearby. But the silence in the mansion continued. The heavy, crushing silence that made everyone speak in whispers, as if being too loud might break something that was already shattered. Richard barely noticed Margaret's quiet work. He was drowning in his own grief, working 18-hour days, avoiding the home that reminded him of everything he'd lost. When he came home late at night, he went straight to his office, locked the door, and drank scotch until he could sleep. The staff worried. The housekeeper, Maria, would shake her head sadly. The groundskeeper, Tom, mentioned calling someone, a therapist maybe, or a family member. But no one knew what to do. How do you fix a broken family when grief has wrapped around everyone like chains? Actually, let me pause here because this detail is important. Margaret noticed something the others had missed. Emma wasn't just silent. She was listening, desperately listening, for something. Anything that might sound like home used to sound. Late one afternoon, Margaret found old videos on Emma's tablet. Sarah Foster playing piano. Sarah singing lullabies. Sarah's voice, warm and loving, filling their world with music. That's when Margaret understood. The mansion wasn't just silent, it was wrong. The absence of music, of song, of joy, it was like missing oxygen. This house needed to breathe again. But Margaret was scared. What if she tried and failed? What if she made things worse? What if her voice, her presence, her efforts weren't enough? She almost didn't do it. She almost stayed quiet like everyone else. What happened next would haunt her forever, in the most beautiful way possible. On that cold Tuesday morning, 47 days after Sarah's death, Margaret was making breakfast. French toast, Emma's favorite, though the girl barely touched food anymore. The kitchen was empty except for her, golden sunlight streaming through the tall windows. And without planning it, without thinking, Margaret started to sing. It was an old lullaby her own grandmother had taught her. Simple words about stars and dreams and tomorrow. Her voice wasn't perfect. It cracked a little with age. But it was real. It was warm. It was alive. Upstairs, Emma was having another nightmare. She woke up crying, calling for her mama, her small body shaking. But then, she heard it. A voice. Not Mama's voice, but something that felt like safety anyway. Something that felt like being held. Emma got out of bed. Her small feet, bare on the cold floor, carried her to the hallway. Down the grand staircase, following that sound like a lifeline. In his office, Richard had just arrived home early, the first time in weeks. He stood frozen, his briefcase still in his hand, listening to something that made his chest ache. Someone was singing in his house. In his silent, broken house, someone was bringing music back. What they didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that in the next few minutes, everything was about to change. Because grief, it turns out, isn't meant to be faced in silence. And sometimes, the most powerful thing in the world isn't money or power or status. Sometimes, it's just one person brave enough to sing. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss the next powerful billionaire story. Margaret didn't hear Emma coming down the stairs. She was lost in the song, her eyes closed, swaying slightly as she flipped the French toast. The melody poured out of her, carrying memories of every child she'd ever comforted, every tear she'd ever dried. She didn't know she had an audience. Then she felt it. A small hand, cold and trembling, slipping into hers. Margaret's eyes flew open. Emma stood beside her in her wrinkled pajamas, her face wet with tears, staring up at Margaret with eyes that hadn't looked at anyone in weeks. The little girl's lips were moving, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her own voice breaking. She knelt down, still holding Emma's hand. "It's okay. You don't have to talk. We can just sing," Emma croaked, her first word in 47 days. "Sing, like Mama. What would you have done in this situation?" Margaret's heart shattered and rebuilt itself in the same moment. She pulled Emma close, and the little girl collapsed into her arms, sobbing like the child she was supposed to be. And Margaret sang. She sang the lullaby again, and then another and another, rocking Emma gently as morning light filled the kitchen. Neither of them noticed Richard standing in the doorway. He'd followed the sound of singing like a man in a dream. But now, watching his daughter, his silent, broken daughter, crying and being held, hearing her speak, he couldn't move. His throat closed up. His eyes burned. His chest felt like it was caving in. This stranger, this woman he barely knew, was doing what he couldn't. She was reaching Emma. She was bringing his daughter back to life. And Richard Foster, billionaire, genius, man who solved impossible problems for a living, had never felt more useless in his entire life. Actually, let me pause here because what happened next changed everything. Mr. Foster. Margaret had seen him. She didn't let go of Emma, but her eyes met his over the child's blonde head. There was no judgment in Margaret's gaze. Just understanding. Just invitation. She needs you, Margaret said softly. She's been waiting for you. Richard shook his head, backing away. I can't. I don't know how to. Yes, you do, Margaret interrupted gently. You're her father. You're exactly what she needs. Emma lifted her tear-stained face from Margaret's shoulder. She saw her daddy standing there, looking lost and scared and broken. And in that moment, Emma realized something that children shouldn't have to realize. Her father was hurting too. Daddy! Her voice was tiny, uncertain. That one word broke him. Richard crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and fell to his knees beside them. He wrapped his arms around Emma, pulling her close, and for the first time since Sarah died, he let himself cry. Not silent tears in his office at midnight. Not the controlled grief he showed at the funeral. Real, gasping, desperate sobs. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so sorry, baby. I've been so lost. I didn't know. I couldn't. Daddy's sad too, Emma whispered, patting his face with her small hand. Like me. Can you imagine this little girl, drowning in her own grief, finding the strength to comfort her father? Margaret stepped back, giving them space but staying close. She watched as father and daughter held each other, as walls that had been built from fear and pain started to crumble. The French toast was burning on the stove, but nobody cared. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more emotional and powerful billionaire stories coming soon. Little did they know, the hardest part was still ahead. The next 3 weeks changed everything in the Foster mansion. Richard canceled his morning meetings, then his afternoon ones. He started working from home, his office door open for the first time in months. Emma began talking again. Slowly at first, just a few words here and there, but each day a little more. And Margaret? She filled that enormous house with music. She sang while cooking breakfast. She hummed while folding laundry. She taught Emma simple songs, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Richard would hum along too. The other staff noticed. Maria, the housekeeper, started smiling again. Tom, the groundskeeper, whistled while trimming hedges. The mansion wasn't just a building anymore. It was becoming a home again. But grief isn't a straight line, and healing isn't simple. Wait, I need to tell you something crucial. One afternoon, Emma asked Margaret a question that made everyone freeze. Is Mama ever coming back? They were in the music room, Sarah's favorite place. The grand piano sat untouched, covered with a white sheet like a ghost. Emma stared at it, her small hand in Margaret's. Margaret knelt down, looking Emma straight in the eye. Richard stood in the doorway, holding his breath, wondering how anyone could answer that question. No, sweetheart, Margaret said gently. Your mama's not coming back. And that's the hardest, saddest thing in the whole world. Emma's face crumpled. But I miss her. I know. And you always will. That's okay. Margaret squeezed her hand. But you want to know something? Your mama left you so many gifts. She left you your daddy, who loves you more than anything. She left you her beautiful smile. And she left you music. Emma looked at the covered piano. I can't play like Mama. Not yet, Margaret agreed. But you could learn. And every time you play it would be like keeping a piece of her alive. Like singing her back to life in a new way. What happened next still gives me goosebumps. Emma walked to the piano. Her small hands pulled the white sheet off, letting it pool on the floor. Dust floated in the afternoon sunlight. She climbed onto the bench, too small, her feet not reaching the pedals, and pressed one key. The note rang out, clear and true, the first music that piano had made in months. "Will you teach me?" Emma asked, looking back at Margaret. But it wasn't Margaret who answered. "I will," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. He crossed the room and sat beside his daughter on the bench. "Your mama taught me some songs a long time ago, before we had you. I'm not very good, but we could learn together." Emma's face lit up, the first real smile since the accident. "Really? Really?" Richard looked at Margaret over his daughter's head, mouthing two words. "Thank you." Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes, and started to leave. But Emma called out, "Margaret, will you stay and sing with us?" And so they did. A billionaire, a 7-year-old girl, and a 63-year-old nanny who'd worked 40 years loving other people's children. Together, they made music in a room that had been silent too long. Richard played simple notes, clumsy, unpracticed, missing keys. Emma giggled and tried to help, and Margaret sang, her warm voice filling the spaces between the notes, turning their awkward attempts into something beautiful. The music wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was alive. It was healing. And in that moment, the Foster mansion wasn't silent anymore. That night, after Emma was tucked into bed, actually sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, Richard found Margaret in the kitchen. "I need to tell you something," he said. Margaret turned from the dishes, drying her hands on a towel. "When my wife died," Richard continued, his voice quiet, "I thought my daughter died too. Not physically, but the light in her. I thought it was gone forever. I thought I'd failed her so completely that there was no coming back." He paused, struggling with words. "You gave her back to me. You gave us both a reason to try again." Margaret shook her head gently. "I didn't give you anything, Mr. Foster. It was already there. You both just needed someone to help you remember how to reach for it." "Still," Richard said, "I want you to know." His voice cracked. "You didn't just save my daughter. You saved me too." What they didn't know was that Emma was listening from the stairs, smiling in the darkness. And what no one could have predicted was that this was just the beginning. Because sometimes, when you find the courage to break the silence, you discover that the most powerful thing in the world isn't money or status or power. It's love. It's music. It's showing up, day after day, even when it's hard. It's being brave enough to sing in a house that's forgotten how. 6 months later, the Foster mansion was unrecognizable. Not because Richard had renovated it, though he'd removed the white sheets from Sarah's belongings and opened the curtains she'd loved. Not because they'd hired more staff or bought new furniture. The change was something money couldn't buy. The mansion was alive with sound. Emma's piano practice filled the afternoons. She wasn't perfect. Her small fingers still stumbled over difficult passages, but she played with joy. Richard had started joining her, their duets clumsy but filled with laughter. And Margaret? She'd become the heartbeat of the house, her songs and humming a constant reminder that grief and joy could exist together. But on this particular Saturday morning, something unexpected was about to happen. Richard sat in his office, reviewing documents for a board meeting, when he heard voices in the foyer. Many voices, children's voices. He walked out to find his entrance hall filled with people. Not wealthy people in expensive clothes, regular families. Some in worn jackets, mothers holding babies, children with wide eyes staring at the chandelier. And in the middle of it all stood Margaret, with Emma by her side, both wearing matching aprons. "What's going on?" Richard asked, bewildered. Emma ran to him, grabbing his hand. "Daddy!" It's Margaret's surprise. "Tell him, Margaret." Little did Richard know, this moment would show him what real wealth looked like. Margaret smiled, a bit nervous. "Mr. Foster, I should have asked permission first. But Emma and I had an idea, and well, we decided to just do it." "Do what?" Richard looked around at the dozen families crowding his foyer. "Music lessons," Emma announced proudly. "Free music lessons. for kids whose families can't pay for them, like Mama used to do at the community center before. Emma's voice trailed off, but she didn't look sad. She looked determined. Margaret stepped forward. Your wife Sarah ran a music program for underprivileged children. I found the records in the music room. After she died, the program shut down. No funding, no space, no teacher. She gestured to the families. These people have been waiting for 6 months, hoping it might come back. Richard felt his throat tighten. He'd been so buried in his grief, he'd forgotten. Sarah had loved that program. She'd called it her real work, more important than any charity gala or fundraiser. Wait, I need to tell you something crucial. A little boy, maybe 5 years old, tugged on Richard's sleeve. Mister, is it true? Can we really learn music here? My mama says music is for rich kids, but I want to learn so bad. Richard looked down at the child's hopeful face, then at Emma, who was watching him with her mother's eyes, then at Margaret, who had somehow seen what this family needed. Not just Emma and himself, but the bigger family Sarah had tried to build. Yes, Richard heard himself say. Yes, you can learn music here. The room erupted in cheers. What happened next still brings tears to my eyes. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful billionaire story. Within weeks, the Sarah Foster Music Program was reborn. Richard hired 3 music teachers, not just any teachers, but the ones Sarah had worked with before. He converted the East Wing's unused rooms into practice spaces. He bought instruments, dozens of them, from child-sized violins to keyboards to guitars. Every Saturday morning, the silent mansion filled with the chaotic, beautiful sound of children learning music. Scale practice mixed with laughter. Wrong notes followed by cheers when someone got it right. The marble halls that had echoed with grief now rang with life. Emma thrived. She helped the younger children, showing them how to hold the piano correctly, encouraging them when they wanted to quit. She wasn't just learning music. She was learning her mother's gift of giving. Can you imagine how proud Sarah would have been? Richard found himself coming home early on Saturdays, sitting in the back of rooms, watching Emma teach. Sometimes parents would recognize him, the billionaire tech mogul, and look uncomfortable. But he'd smile and chat about their kids' progress, and slowly, the discomfort faded. Margaret watched it all with quiet satisfaction. This was what she'd hoped for. Not just healing, but transformation. Not just survival, but purpose. But there was one more surprise coming. 3 months after the program started, Richard called Margaret into his office. Emma was with him, bouncing excitedly in a chair. Sit down, Richard said, and Margaret noticed his eyes were red. I need to ask you something. Margaret sat suddenly worried. Is something wrong? No, Richard said quickly. Everything's right. That's the problem, or not a problem, but... He took a breath. Margaret, you were supposed to be temporary. A nanny until Emma recovered. But you've become your family now. To both of us. Emma nodded vigorously. We want you to stay forever. Margaret felt her own eyes fill with tears. Mr. Foster, Richard, he corrected. Please. After everything, I think we're past formalities. He pulled out a document. I'm not asking you to be Emma's nanny anymore. I'm asking you to be part of this family. Officially. I've had papers drawn up. You'd have a permanent place here, a home for life, and a position as director of the Sarah Foster Music Program. Actually, let me pause here because this is important. Margaret had spent 40 years raising other people's children. She'd loved them all, then watched them grow up and move on. She'd always been the helper, the employee, the one who left when the job was done. She'd never expected to be chosen, to be kept, to be family. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Emma pleaded. Please, Margaret. We need you. I need you. You taught us how to sing again, Richard said softly. How to live again. How to honor Sarah's memory by continuing her work. You didn't just save us. You showed us how to save others. His voice cracked. Let us give back to you. Let us be your family too. Margaret looked at these two people. This man and this child who had been broken and lost, who had found their way back to joy. She thought about her empty apartment across town. She thought about all the years of leaving, of being temporary, of loving and letting go. And then she thought about songs in the kitchen, about piano duets that ended in laughter, about children learning that music wasn't just for the rich, it was for anyone brave enough to try. "Yes," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll stay." Emma launched herself into Margaret's arms. Richard joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them. And in that moment, they weren't employer and employee. They weren't billionaire and nanny and child. They were family. 1 year after Sarah's death, the Foster Mansion held a special concert. The music room was packed with people. Parents, children, teachers, donors who'd heard about the program and wanted to help. The local news had even sent a camera crew. Emma sat at her mother's piano, no longer too small for the bench. Her fingers, no longer clumsy, moved across the keys with growing confidence. She played the lullaby Margaret had sung that morning in the kitchen, the song that had started everything. Richard stood nearby, watching his daughter, his heart full. Margaret sat in the front row, beaming with pride. When Emma finished, the room erupted in applause. But Emma held up her hand for quiet. "This program," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is for my mama. She believed everyone deserves music. But it's also for Margaret." Emma looked at her nanny, no, her family member, with love. "Margaret taught me that even when you're sad, you can still sing. And when you sing, you help other people remember how to be happy again." She paused, then added, "Mama used to say that music is magic, but I think people like Margaret are the real magic. Because she showed up when we needed her most, and she stayed." What happened next became the moment everyone remembered. Margaret stood up and joined Emma at the piano. Together, they sang the old lullaby and new songs, complicated pieces and simple melodies. Then other children joined in. Then parents. Then everyone in the room was singing, their voices rising together, filling the mansion with sound and joy and life. Richard closed his eyes and listened. And for the first time since Sarah died, he didn't feel like something was missing. He felt like something new had been built, something beautiful and lasting. Because that's what love does. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't bring back what's lost. But it gives you the courage to sing again, to live again, to open your heart and your home and your life to the people who need you, and who you need too. The billionaire's mansion had been silent, until the Black Nanny sang, and everything changed. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more emotional and powerful billionaire stories coming soon.